I have something special for you today. It's the Republican Professor Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is 11 February 2025, years after you got it. You got it. After Mo Fiorina wrote the book Congress, Keystone to the Washington Establishment. Just kidding. 2025 years after Jesus. Hello. Hello, friends. It's so good to see you. Um, what an interesting time we're living in. And I have the perfect thing for today from 1978. It speaks to the present moment. I'm so happy to share this material with you today. My mentor, Dr. Michael-Uhlmann, wrote this book called Congress and not the book. He wrote an article called Congress and the Welfare State, the Electoral Connection, Michael M. Uhlmann. And I'm telling you, he was my mentor for over a decade. This is perfect for the present moment in Washington, D.C. I'm telling you, I'm so excited to share this with you. We're going to do a transformative reading. We're going to make a fair use of this material. It was originally published in Common Sense. Um, I want to make the Republican National Committee, I want to thank them for making this material available. Um, it's in pages 15 through 26 in 1978 of Common Sense Journal. The article title is Congress and the Welfare State, the Electoral Connection. I also want to thank Washington State University for making this material available and my friend Chris Wolf, Dr. Chris Wolf, a professor in Texas, Christopher Wolf, who sent this material to me and was talking about it. Now, what is this material here that we're talking about? Well, it is a book review, as it turns out, of a book that I just referenced, Morris Fiorina's Congress Keystone to the Washington Establishment. I use this book when I teach Congress to upper level students at Azusa Pacific University. And I remember Dr. Uhlmann talking about this book in class. What does it have to do with the present moment that we're in, though? Well, you tell me, comment. I want to hear what you have to say. The growth of political freedom in the Western world is inextricably intertwined with the rise of parliamentary institutions. That's how he starts this. Now, his diction and style is beautiful. And he taught this way. He taught how he writes. So when I'm reading this, it's in his voice. This is how he taught class, where I did my PhD in public law. That much is beyond dispute, but the relationship is both more problematic and less intimate than is usually recounted in popular histories. By these accounts, the struggle for liberty is chiefly, if not exclusively, a struggle by elective assemblies against the bastion of hereditary privilege. Focus your mind here. The history of England, as taught to schoolboys, for example, suggests that a providentially inspired straight line of progress joins Magna Carta, the glorious revolution of 1688, cabinet government, reform acts of the 19th century, and the final supremacy of the House of Commons in the 20th. This version of events bears a certain, if general, stamp of truth, but like most schoolboy accounts, it is at most a half truth, sustained less by its historical accuracy than by its conformity with contemporary egalitarian opinion, just as vox populi has come to be regarded as suprema lex, so the legislature has come to embody in a special way the aspirations of the modern democratic era. Let me just comment here really quick. Something about Michael-Uhlmann's educational background. He was an English major at Yale back before Yale was inflating grades and back when they taught English, meaning they taught Shakespeare and Milton. He probably had to read damn Beowulf, poor guy. John Donne. Um, he was uh, therefore familiar with the broad sweep of English history, and the background that it provided for his legal education was wonderful because, of course, as you know, the common law tradition comes from our Anglophilic roots, that is English roots in history. And he studied his LLB at University of Virginia Law School back in the 60s, back before the JD. And he was explaining to me the JD versus the LLB back in 2007 when he convinced me not to go to law school and to come and study law as a PhD student, which I did 2 years later. Um, and he was saying about the LLB that that older law degree that was the most common at the time was attentive to the historic and philosophical and literary roots of our legal tradition. And that's missing. Now the JD is a technocratic degree. And it's like squirting out widgets, it's squirting out technicians, but it's not squirting out deep thinkers about the law. He later got a PhD at Claremont under Harry Jaffa, and who else was on his committee? I can't remember right now, but Harry Jaffa was one of the main guys. Was it Bolitzer? Might have been Bolitzer. I know I think Douglas Adair, Martin Diamond maybe was still around for part of that. I can't remember when Martin Diamond died, tragically. Um, but he was in that group of people. If you know those people, I don't know if you don't, but if you don't worry about it. So he's couching in the first paragraph here, he's couching his comments in historical tradition here. Now, the American founding fathers, no schoolboys they, entertained a somewhat less roseate vision of the legislature's role in the march of political progress. 150 years of experience with legislative caprice, both in the colonies and across the water, suggested to them that elective assemblies could endanger liberty no less than hereditary monarchs. That is a huge thing he just said. He's just saying the American founding fathers were drawing from lessons in self-government that spanned a century and a half in the colonies. And what they learned was that majorities in legislatures were a danger to liberty, individual liberty, a danger to individual liberty. And said another way, they were a danger to the protection of the natural law in positive law. They tended to pervert the tight connection that should exist. Okay, so that's a huge thing. Indeed, one would be hard-pressed to articulate a more comprehensive catalog of the mischief legislators can make than that which may be found in the debates at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Legislative bodies, it was said, were inclined to be volatile, short-sighted, venal, and corruptible. Courage and moderation were not, generally speaking, their dominant characteristics. There's a description of Michael-Uhlmann, an attorney with a Ph.D., was Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice. That's right. He was Senate confirmed along with Antonin Scalia as Assistant U.S. Attorney. They served together. That's how they got to know each other. Let me give you a fun little anecdote. The last class I had with Michael-Uhlmann was spring of 2016. It was called The Rise and Operations of the Administrative State. I was also taking two classes from Charles Kessler that semester, Liberalism and Conservatism and Natural Law over at Claremont McKenna College. And anyway, I was in that class with Master Sergeant John Boswell, retired Delta Force operator, who we featured his work on the podcast last year in several episodes. Check that out. So I'm in this class in spring of 2016, and the only time I ever saw Michael-Uhlmann take a call during class. Now, this guy is, when I came in the classroom, he would always tell me to take my hat off. The phones were not allowed, okay? He took a call from Maureen Scalia, and it had to do with funeral arrangements for Antonin Scalia, who had been just earlier in the semester, just like 1 week before, had been Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Uhlmann served with him in the Ford Justice Department. And I don't think the description says that, but it was Ford who promoted Uhlmann from a staff position in the Senate, where he was serving New York U.S. Senator James Buckley. He was on his staff. James Buckley later became a federal judge, district judge. His brother's William F. Buckley Jr., who started National Review. James Buckley was from the Conservative Party, and he was elected from the state of New York, if you can believe that, in the 70s, early 70s. And Uhlmann was on his staff, pretty prominent position on his staff, and in fact is credited with basically almost single-handedly saving the Electoral College. And I heard Chris DeMuth say that. And you could look that up. It's on YouTube. It's on, who are we remembering? Oh yeah, it's on Michael-Uhlmann's memorial on YouTube. Clarence Thomas is there. He died in 2019, so Scalia was not there because Scalia died in 2016. Charles Kessler was there. Hadley Arkes is the kind of the ringleader. C. Boyden Gray was there, who has a whole administrative state center named after him at George Mason. C. Boyden Gray says of Uhlmann, he was the best teacher I ever had. That's what he says. Best teacher I ever had. This guy right here. Uh, I know that there's a lot of people that hate Attorney General Barr, but he was there. While he was Attorney General, he was there. He's sitting in the audience, and you can hear his voice, and you can actually see him, I think. And he says he learned constitutional law sitting on Michael Uhlmann's couch from him. That's my constitutional law teacher. Now I'm probably gonna, a lot of people hate me now because Barr, they interpret Barr as like an anti-Trump guy. I don't think Barr was an anti-Trump guy. I just think he was trying to do a good job. Anyway, I don't want to get into Barr. He was a wonderful mentor, and Uhlmann did not like Trump. He was not a Trump fan, but he was not a never Trumper. And there's a big difference. And it's not quite unlike someone else like J.D. Vance, for example, who was not a fan of Trump. But was he a never Trumper? Well, you tell me. He's vice president right now. People have come along, you know, and uh, I'm doing a lot here. I'm explaining who he was. Michael Uhlmann was appointed by President Ronald Reagan to be White House, a pretty significant position in the White House as special assistant to the president. Um, he was a legal advisor to President Reagan, and he was also on the transition team to Bush Sr. He convinced Clarence Thomas to become a federal judge over lunch or at Denny's or whatever. It's in My Grandfather's Son, Clarence Thomas's book, autobiography, mentions this guy. So he's a very special man. This is a wonderful article. I'm going to keep going. When caution was required, they tended to act precipitously. When dispatch was necessary, they seemed to dally incessantly. This is wonderful prose. Ever quick to wrap themselves in the mantle of popular will. Now turn the page here. I got a printout here. It's on paper. Sound like Rush Limbaugh right now. You know how I used to rustle the papers there? Ever quick to wrap themselves in the mantle of popular will, legislators nonetheless evinced an unerring capacity to do very well for themselves at the same time. Above all, the legislature was thought to be a hotbed of factional intrigue in which the common good was too easily equated with the dominant interest of the moment. This somewhat jaundiced catalog of legislative shortcomings, of course, has a contemporary ring, and its particulars may be found in one form or another in the pages of almost every major newspaper. That's so 1978. Newspaper. I love it. In this, as in other things, the founding fathers were remarkably prescient. But even as they understood the vices to which legislatures were prone, the framers understood the virtues of which they were capable. Praise God. For one thing, the legislature could generally be relied upon to check the vainglories of the executive. More importantly, it could bring to the formulation of public policy. Indeed, if properly structured, it would embody what James Madison called the deliberate sense of the people. The genius of American Constitution consists, the genius of the American Constitution consists, this is where you want to pay attention. You hear a sentence like that, you want to pay attention. The genius of the American Constitution consists, among other things, in the way in which Congress is provided both the constitutional authority and the political incentive to perform both tasks. American popular opinion has inherited from the framers a certain ambivalence toward Congress. An appreciation of its virtues is almost always offset by a deeply rooted suspicion of legislative excess. If anything, the latter sentiment, more often than not, predominates. Thus, even when it's on its best behavior, Congress, like comedian Rodney Dangerfield, just don't get no respect. There seems to be an irreducible conviction that much of what Congress does is just a bit shabby. The public seems unwilling to grant to Congress the esteem that it quite regularly, until recently at least, lavishes upon the presidency. Indeed, it is rare when Congress as a whole is esteemed very highly at all. This relatively low esteem in which the public has traditionally held Congress contrasts sharply with relatively high esteem for many of the things, and I'm switching sides here. Many of the things that Congress does or is expected to do. Specifically, the creation of special interest programs. Does that sound contemporary to you? Does that sound like something that's going on right now? This apparent anomaly in the public attitude toward Congress may perhaps be explained by analogy to the spoiled child's attitude toward his parents. Boy, this is good. This is good. He wants what he wants and will squawk like the devil when he doesn't get it, if he doesn't get it, but he doesn't necessarily respect his parents for giving it to him. In short, the public seems to have arrived at the conclusion that when you add up all the private interests that Congress busies itself in satisfying, you still end up with something short of the common good. Comment below. Let me know what you think about this. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. It is to the presidency rather than to Congress that the public has traditionally looked for the disinterested pursuit of the common good, and esteem for the presidency at any given time may be taken as a measure of the public's belief in the possibility of achieving such good. What is he saying here? I mean, this is very timely. Yes, it's to the president that we look to solve this thing that is kind of endemic. We ask Congress to give us certain things to satisfy our private desires. Congress no way can do all that. They try. Like a spoiled child, we take what we can. We didn't get enough as what we wanted. It's interesting. Although it may come as a surprise. By the way, all that special interest stuff, all of the spending that's being uncovered, that was all authorized by Congress. Why would you doubt that? Have you seen these spending bills? They're so vague. Spend money on this, clean the air. Well, yeah, they're more detailed than that, but they say EPA make rules to clean the air. You legislate. ATF reduce gun violence. You come up with the rules. You legislate. I could go on and on. I mean, U.S. aid. I mean, make the world safe for democracy, whatever that means. Oh, you can, something that vague, you're going to come up with a host of contradictions. What could possibly go wrong? And people, they can't pay attention to all these details. Although it may come as a surprise to those whose understanding of American politics is limited to the literature on the imperial presidency, we are now living and have lived for some time in the midst of a congressional hegemony. This is not a novel event in American history, nor is it likely to be the last such occurrence. But the dominion of Congress at the present hour is a peculiar one, and not least because, for all its power, Congress seems unsure of its proper role. The more strident congressional hegemonists, Representative John Moss of California, for example, loudly declaim the special prerogatives vested in them by the Constitution. So extravagant are these claims, especially in the wake of Watergate, that one would think that the framers had stopped drafting after completing Article 1. That's the article that creates Congress in the Constitution. But beyond pious invocations to the effect that the Constitution really sought to make Congress supreme, the thrust of which is to reduce the president to a glorified errand boy. That's wonderful prose. There seems to be precious little agreement, doing the Rush Limbaugh, shuffling the papers. There seems to be precious little agreement on anything. The reasons for the present confusion are complex, and detailed discussion must be deferred to another occasion. By way of summary, however, this much may be said. A concantation of chance events, moral lapses, political blunders has left us with a weakened presidency. He's talking about Nixon, by the way, and Ford. At the same time, Congress has, through a serious, unfortunate reforms, destroyed most of its internal mechanisms for self-discipline. The result is that while Congress is incapable of asserting a reasonably coherent collective will of its own, it is nonetheless capable of frustrating the creation or execution of policy emanating from the presidency. Given what Republicans understand President Carter to intend, remember, this is 1978, Carter was president. This last is not necessarily a bad thing, but one takes no partisan pride in having to remark the low estate to which the presidency as an institution has fallen. Still, for all the confusion, there is no mistaking the fact that Congress is now firmly in the saddle. The trouble seems to be that the horse it rides is on a merry-go-round. Oh, this is great prose. And that's exactly how he talked in class. I mean, that's how he lectured. That's how he lectured. That, at least, is the suggestion of a recent book by Professor Morris Fiorina of the Political Science Department of Caltech. In Congress, Keystone of the Washington Establishment, Yale University Press, 1977. Professor Fiorina has written both a tract for our times and a model piece of academic political sociology. In the short space of 100 pages, He has crammed more political insight, sound intuitive judgment, and common sense than can be found in the next dozen books on Congress combined. Wow. Man, what a compliment. In a work that is refreshingly free from academic cant, he reveals wow, a gimlet eye for telling detail, a comprehension of the big picture, and a bemused, if understandably impatient tolerance for those who make their living by obtaining and retaining congressional seats. This is a work that can be read with profit by both layman and professional alike, and what is more, at a single sitting. Wow. I don't know about that, Mike. Maybe you, not me. I taught this book in class to upper level, and I don't think I couldn't do it in a single setting. I know for a fact they couldn't. Maybe some of Elon's kids can do it, but I doubt it. If there is a single book that ought to be read by more or less everyone who's worried about the present condition and future of Congress, this is it. Now, let me show you the book. Here's the book. I showed it earlier. It's not very thick. I mean, about a fingernail thick, I guess. This is the second edition. And it's got how many pages? 141. And then it's got some endnotes, which I hate endnotes, but that's the book. Let's return to Uhlmann. Fiorina's thesis in a nutshell is that Congress, at first by accident, later by design, has contrived to manipulate the machinery of the welfare state so as to secure more or less permanently the incumbency of its members. That's bracing. That, of course, comes as no surprise to close observers of the Washington scene. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. But it is the specific virtue of Fiorina's book that he has pulled together in one place data sufficient to substantiate the claim to the world at large. He begins by examining the decline and fall of the marginal district, one where the margin of victory is 5% or less of the vote. We are all dimly aware that the rate of incumbency has risen. But did you know that since World War II, approximately 90% of all congressional office holders have sought re-election, and that 90% of those who ran were successful? By contrast, the turnover rate throughout the 19th century was 40 to 50% at each election. And it was not until this century, that is the 1900s, that the continuous service of congressmen averaged 5 years. Relying on studies performed by David Mayhew and others, Fiorina concludes that the marginal district is going the way of the passenger pigeon. Wow. Some people think that term limits are necessary to correct this. I'm not sure that term limits will have a positive effect. I think that the negative effect might be greater than the positive effect. And we'll talk about that another time. I've already talked about it in different places, but maybe I'll do a whole episode on that. I'm not convinced. Having identified the victim, he then asked, who done it? He raises but dismisses a number of hypothetical explanations: increased socioeconomic homogeneity of constituencies and redistricting, for example. The telling cue, he suggests, lies rather in the changing behavior of incumbents and specifically the ways in which they create and manipulate the machinery of the social service state to their own advantage. Did you hear that? Did you hear that? Since the New Deal era, he writes, the average congressman's desire for reelection has remained constant. What has changed is the set of resources he possesses to invest in his reelection effort. Today's congressmen have more productive political strategies than previously, and these strangers are an unforeseen, at least by us, byproduct of the growth of an activist federal government. Wow. Rush Limbaugh. Fiorina sustains his thesis by examining the internal structure of Congress and its relationship to interest groups and executive branch bureaucrats, and by showing how the great engine of big government has this is one I'm having a great time. I don't know about you. By showing that how the great engine of big government has been converted into a highly successful re-election machine. Dude, put that on a coffee mug. That's your quote right there. He finds, among other things, that pork barreling and casework have come to dominate lawmaking in the mix of legislative activities, so much so that the typical congressman pays little attention to the substance of public policy. Well, yeah, who has time? It's like you didn't even know that it was possible to think about public policy. Pork barreling and casework, he concludes, are basically pure political profit. Substantive legislating, by contrast, generates political controversy and potentially injurious electoral fallout. That's because of the voters. Indeed, Congress bends over backwards to avoid policy questions that are unrelated to the short-term bread and butter interests of constituents. Instead, in Senator Howard Baker's splendid metaphor, instead of biting the bullet, they sort of walk up and gum it a little bit. A typical piece of programmatic legislation begins with a God, home, and mother exordium clause which trumpets in often ambiguous and sometimes contradictory terms a finding of some sort. A series of authorizing clauses then establishes a program or agency to remedy the problem established by the finding. The legislation will typically conclude with a catch-all clause empowering an agency head. That's in the executive branch, by the way. Empowering an agency head to issue such rules and regulations as may be necessary to carry out the purpose of this act. So in other words, they're punting over to the executive branch and saying, "Hey, you do it. You legislate. We're just going to sit back and help our constituents find their way through this maze of bureaucracy, and then they'll like us and they'll reelect us." This is very interesting. Never mind that the program may operate at cross purposes with five others previously enacted. Never mind that the act may itself contain insoluble contradictions. Never mind that the act may not be understood, even if it does make sense, by more than a handful of members of Congress. Never mind that the bureaucracy, who probably drafted the act to begin with, will interpret the enactment however it reads, pretty much as it pleases. And never mind that this sort of thing has produced, after a generation, a Federal Register that affects the body politic with 70,000 pages annually. And that's in 1978, friends. None of that in today's Congress is finally important. What is important is the connection between this kind of legislating and the congressman's reelection, a connection with which Fiorina delineates in convincing fashion. I want to say right now that if you were judging a congressman or a member of Congress for wanting to be reelected, I would say that um, you're struggling with a mild case of idiocy and you need to get it checked out. And I'm glad that you came to me because I'm your doctor. Folks, being motivated to be reelected is the point of being a politician. That's the whole point. They want to do a good job because they want to get reelected. You can't just rely on their um, sense of goodwill. You have to have something in it for them. That's the whole point of wanting to be to do a good job. That's just human nature. It's like a promotion in a way, except for its reelection. You don't want politicians that have no interest in being reelected because then you have to wonder what is their interest? Why do they want to be in that position? I'm personally a little bit worried by a politician that has nothing to lose. I'm a little bit worried because it would allow him to ignore the people who put him there. What could possibly go wrong with that? You want a tight connection between the people who put them there, what they want, and reelection. That's the whole theory of our system, and we have to tighten it up. There's things we can do to tighten that up. You don't want to jettison it because why have elections at all? It would make no sense. A term limit is the next election. That's the whole system that is designed by the founding fathers. They didn't put term limits in there. The term limits were called elections. Okay? It's not that hard. It's not that hard. If there's a problem, you got to fix it. You don't fix it by undermining the entire system. That's not how you do it. And I think term limits undermine the whole thing. Okay, let's continue. I mean, the problem is the voters. The voters have to be on top of this stuff. I mean, the voters can't be in charge and not in charge at the same time and in the same respect. That's a contradiction. Okay, let's keep going. Let me know what your questions are, comments. Put them in the comments. Let me know. I know you have your own thoughts. Where did I leave off? I don't even know where I left off. Crap. I started preaching. Okay. Federal Register. Okay. Given a choice between obtaining a model cities demonstration grant and deliberating about the wisdom of federal housing policy, obtaining the grant wins every time. And come election day, the grantee will help the congressman multiply the problems confronting a prospective HUD grantee by the literally thousands of programs which now exist to aid or afflict, take your pick, the citizenry, and you have a rough picture of the Washington establishment at whose center sits the Congress. But let Professor Fiorina speak for himself. Quote, the nature of the Washington system is now quite clear. Congressmen, typically the majority Democrats, And I underlined that in my copy. Earn electoral credits by establishing various federal programs. Does this remind you of anything going on right now? The minority Republicans typically earn credits by fighting the good fight. The legislation is drafted in very general terms. So some agency existing or newly established must translate the vague policy mandate into a functioning program, a process that necessitates the promulgation of numerous rules and regulations and, incidentally, the trampling of numerous toes. At the next stage, aggrieved and or hopeful constituents petition their congressman to intervene in the complex or at least obscure decision processes of the bureaucracy. The cycle closes when the congressman lends a sympathetic ear, piously denounces the evils of bureaucracy, and intervenes in the latter's decisions and rides a grateful electorate to ever more impressive electoral showings. Congressmen take credit for coming and going. They are the alpha and the omega. End quote. That summary may be dismissed by some as unduly cynical, but to almost anyone other than a lifelong resident of, say, Plains, Georgia, it is a remarkably succinct description of life along the Potomac these days. The principal beneficiaries of this system are, as Fiorina points out, the congressmen, who are chiefly responsible for its creation, maintenance, and expansion. The bureaucrats are on congressional staffs and in departments and agencies who, along with the federal judges, are the real arbiters of substantive policy in the welfare state. And the non-governmental bureaucrats who staff the quasi-public private agencies, think the Kennedy Center. I mean, I don't see people complaining that Trump is taking over AMC theaters in Fullerton or, the Improv in Brea or Broadway. That's because those are private. The Kennedy Center, though, has federal tentacles attached to dollars. If you're really worried about it, defund it. Defund the Kennedy Center. Okay? It's like that. It's so obvious. Hello. As Michael-Uhlmann used to say in class, hello. Wow. And the non-governmental bureaucrats who staff the quasi-public private agencies, NPR, with Steve Inskeep getting $500,000 a year. Wow. Steve Inskeep? 500,000? Really? Institutes, universities, foundations, to and through whom much of the largest government is dispensed. On the bottom rung stands the aggrieved citizen who is the nominal beneficiary of the largesse to begin with, but who is only sometimes the actual beneficiary. I'm going to read that again. On the bottom rung stands the aggrieved citizen who is the nominal beneficiary of the largesse to begin with, but who is only sometimes the actual beneficiary. See, that's what you're seeing right now. That citizen is Republican. There's enough of them now that they have control of Washington. And there's a temperament in the Republican Party that isn't averse to breaking dishes. in the dining room to make a point. What the Democrats would say, that is precious china. That is dishes, you know, how it's called that. That many of these citizen beneficiaries are also aggrieved taxpayers has only recently penetrated the political consciousness of those who administer the welfare state. But with what long run consequence, it is hard to say. Among the other attributes of the Washington system, to use Fiorina's phrase, remember Fiorina's book right here. Remember this, right? We're talking about this book, which I used in class. And I use in class when I teach the Congress to upper level kids. How are we doing on time? We got to keep going because this is really important. That many of these citizen beneficiaries are also aggrieved taxpayers has only recently penetrated the political consciousness of those who administer the welfare state. But with what long run consequence, it's hard to say. Among the other attributes of the Washington system, to use Fiorina's phrase, is its ability to obscure its long run political, economic, and social costs. To return to our simple hypothetical example, bearing in mind that it applies across the entire range of federal benefits, the would-be HUD grantee knows that his congressman has become an indispensable part of the formula for success. He is there, after all, to help with precisely such problems. Is he not? Indeed, the congressman has probably reminded our would-be grantee 3 or 4 times by franked mail during the year that he is there to help. Oh my gosh. I could make comments here. Our HUD supplicant may even have a friend who was recently helped by the congressman's office, and he will discover, if he hasn't done so already, that in even numbered years, especially, that's when they're up for reelection, the congressman is only too anxious to render assistance. The incumbent, for his part, is well aware that his continued incumbency depends decisively on the skill which he services the infinite variety of problems his constituents encounter in dealing with the federal government, the freaking huge federal government. That the congressman is that this is key. That the congressman is himself an architect of the delivery system, which is so faulty as to require his continuing intervention, is not as yet widely perceived by the electorate. To the electorate, the congressman is an omnipresent ombudsman who sees to it that the constituent gets what he deserves. He's the guy who loses Mrs. Jones' check from the Hugh computer. He's the guy who engineers the local firm's contract for federal highway construction. He's the guy who gets the demonstration grant for the vocational education program at the high school, and so on, more or less ad infinitum. Wow. The big spenders, the protectors of all those special interests and the constituents hear about on television, the architects of big government, he complains to his neighbors about. These, of course, are the other 434 members of the House or the other 99 senators. Wow. Tell me what you really think. Uhlmann, thank you, Lord, for Michael Uhlmann. Can I just pray right now? Thank you for Michael-Uhlmann. This is so good. I'm so grateful for Michael-Uhlmann. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this with you. Thus it is that big government begets a self-reinforcing political culture among the electorate. Yeah, yeah, preach it. Wow. Which obscures the connection between the constituents' favored programs and the growth of the welfare state. Under a government sustained by a political culture of frugality, the creation of a special benefit will cause the electorate to ask of the intended beneficiary, why him? But as government expands, and with it the class of direct and indirect beneficiaries, the question becomes, why not me? Between these two questions stands nearly a half a century of government that, like Topsy, just growed. That's the key quotation from the whole thing right there. The operative political assumption of the welfare state appears to have been perfectly captured in Lord Keynes' cynical remark that in the long run we are all dead. Under its aegis, both the congressman and his constituents have an immediate vested interest that dominates all others. The congressman to get reelected, the constituents to get their benefits. Such short run concerns, as Dr. Johnson said about death in the morning, marvelously concentrate the mind. What is mischievous about this system is not that the people who run it or who benefit from it are bad people. They are not, nor is it that they are any more single minded in the pursuit of self interest than the rest of us. They are not. Nor is it even that many programs may be intrinsically undesirable. The real mischief of the present system is that it spawns the belief that the real business of government ought to consist in the satisfaction of all private demands that are made upon it. That is probably the second most important quotation in this piece. But a moment's reflection will establish that the supply of such demands, social scientists call them felt needs. Doing Rush Limbaugh there, is infinite. Excuse me. And that the most humane government imaginable could not possibly hope to satisfy them. I'm actually not sure if Zoom cancels out the noise of me shuffling papers. I'm not sure it does. I'm trying to mimic Rush Limbaugh there. Such long run reflections, however, war with the self interested calculus of the moment. Even among those of frugal disposition, the growth of government induces after a time a certain cynicism. As the government grows, so does the opinion that one is a fool if one does not line up at the trough. That's the third most important quotation. Indeed, the dominant part of domestic politics at the moment seems to consist in little more than jockeying for position in line. See, that's why these Democrats are freaking out right now. They're in line. I mean, they're like, hey, I'm waiting in line. And Elon is saying, no, no, we're closed. Sorry. What are you talking about? See, they've been brainwashed to think of government as the purpose of government is to satisfy their private satisfactions, their felt needs. That's not really the theory of American government. It's not the appropriate theory. Not that they've thought about it carefully. Thankfully, some have. Well, where did I leave off? In the welfare state, I'm right here. In the welfare state, the government is so overwhelmed with the short term questions of who gets what that there is precious little time and even less political incentive to deliberate about the long run of implications of what government does. One of the most telling insights of Fiorina's book is his recognition that in the welfare state, the larger questions of public policy are shunted aside. They are, at most, incidental byproducts of the system. Policy emerges, if at all, almost as an afterthought. I'm going to pause here to get a cup of coffee. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Where'd I leave off? Um, Jockeying for a position in line. Yeah. In the welfare state, the government is so overwhelmed with the short-term question of who gets what, where, and how that there is precious little time and even less political incentive to deliberate about the long run implications of what government does. That's another coffee mug quote right there. One of the most telling insights of Fiorina's book is his recognition that in the welfare state, the larger questions of public policy are shunted aside. They are at most incidental byproducts of the system. Policy emerges, if at all, almost as an afterthought. And I'm telling you, I I'm a thoughtful person. I'm a deep person. People don't want to be deep. And he's got that. He's nailed it. He's nailed it. But congressmen really should be deep, given what they're doing. But the electorate doesn't reward that. It's the electorate's fault. If you're bored right now, it's your fault. Because a lot of people who are bored by this stuff, if they vote, if there's over a majority, well, that's who gets elected, is people who are bored by these questions. What could possibly go wrong? Teach your kids well, teach them well. I'm telling you, the educational establishment does not nurture curiosity about these things. In the political culture born of the trough line, the suggestion that the trough will someday be empty bespeaks a certain madness, and the critic who raises such a point must be prepared to endure all manner of reprobation. That sound familiar? That's what's happening right now. Right now. It's what's happened every election I can think of, but especially right now because Trump is actually being effective, unlike Romney. And Romney was dragged over the coals for his 47% comment. I mean, I remember being at Loyola Marymount University at a lunch, and um, one of the New Testament professors, I'm not going to say it was Jeff Syker, I'm not going to say that, was just lambasting Republicans. But, he teaches New Testament. So, of course, he knows. Six-figure bureaucrat, professor. All right. He will be accused of being mean-spirited, flinty-hearted, reactionary, and politically naive to boot. Under the circumstances, nothing short of a major catastrophe seems likely to alter the present situation, and less because there is a conspiratorial cabal keeping it in existence than because something like a majority of the people, alas, seem to want it that way. Oh, yeah, that is a better explanation. You might wonder why I prefer that explanation because I teach and I see the students. Do they show up ready to learn? No, they got their phones out. I mean, I don't let them. I raise a fuss, but it's like if you don't even know why you're in college, why would you take voting seriously? If you can't take college seriously when you're studying government, why would you take voting seriously? I mean, there's students see my two types of student from 2023 summer episode on the Republican Professor podcast. Check it out. If you're a student and you have that much contempt for public funding of your own education, why would you take something seriously in the voting booth? Thank God a lot of these people don't even vote because that's how lazy they are. I'm gonna get started preaching here. Don't get me started. Go back to Uhlmann. The majority of the people seem to want it that way, whether they want it because they see it as intrinsically worthy or merely because they see no immediate practical alternative to it. Oh my gosh. Is, in a sense, the central issue in American domestic politics at the moment. It's at our moment too. And in the latter, rather than the former, maybe the case is in a comparable sense the great hope of the Republican Party. I would say, and in 2025, brother. The Congress described by Fiorina would appear to differ from its predecessors in one essential respect. It presides over a bloated governmental establishment. It is a Congress peopled with men who, for the most part, have never known anything but bloated government. Indeed, by men who have achieved political success precisely by making government bloated, because that's what the voters say they want. At least a majority of them. You got to convince a majority that they don't want that and they shouldn't want that. Good luck. That's what I'm trying to do. That's why I exist. In this, however, they are to be compared with their predecessors, chiefly by degree rather than by kind, by opportunity rather than by motive. For all the changes induced by the rise of the welfare state, the behavior and motives described by Fiorina carry one back to the framers' reservations about legislatures. This is nothing new. Human nature is still human nature. There's nothing new under the sun, according to Ecclesiastes. Those reservations retained validity for Woodrow Wilson, who, as a young political scientist, chronicled, even as he lamented the apparent supremacy of Congress in the century following the nation's founding, in a famous work entitled Congressional Government, published in 1885, Wilson described the confusion in public policy which characterized the congressional hegemony of the late 19th century and remarked congressional preoccupation with reelection and with the politics of the pork barrel at the expense of substantive lawmaking. Wilson believed that congressional supremacy had been, for all intents and purposes, foreordained by the framers, that Congress, as he described it, was the inevitable consequence of their deliberations, and that for better or worse, probably for the worse, we were stuck with it. This is a dense piece right here. We were stuck with it. Congressional government went through a number of editions during the closing years of the 19th century, during which Wilson underwent a change of heart, even as the Congress he described underwent changes of its own. These changes gave birth to a new study by Wilson, published in 1908, and entitled, fittingly enough, Constitutional Government. It is a book which may be subtitled only somewhat irreverently, Woodrow Wilson Discovers the Presidency. Boy, did he ever. What Wilson belatedly discovered was um, make sure my pens are stationary there, was that the American constitutional system was not fated to a permanent congressional hegemony, with its attendant confusion on questions of public policy and its obsession with the politics of special interests. Even if the natural tendency of Congress was to split all ends up, it was possible for the president, if he knew what he was doing, to bring together that which was otherwise inclined to fall apart. Wilson's contemporary, Professor Henry Jones Ford, once wrote that Congress retains the essential character imposed on it by the founding fathers, which is to say that it retains a convention of the envoys of locality. That's a wonderful quote right there. The House, and to only a slightly lesser extent the Senate, takes its character from the fact that it represents not the nation, but the districts into which the nation is divided. The size of the nation itself, the infinite variety of interests that are entitled to representation, and the changing fashions of public opinion combine to make congressional business a messy, confusing, and often volatile affair. Under these circumstances, Congress is not a place where one would expect to find, except serendipitously, cool deliberation, long run vision, or coherence of policy. Congress is what it is, and it is folly to expect it to be something else. At its worst, Ford wrote, it lacks the faculty of self government, which, whether in the state or in the individual, implies the supremacy of reason over desire, save when it acts under discipline of party, and such discipline can be imposed as a rule only by presidential action. Congress is inexorably a scuffle of local interests. What does that sound? That sounds like the present moment to me. For all its apparent harshness, Ford's description of Congress is widely shared today. Despite the constitutional pretensions of some contemporary congressional hegemonists, Congress cannot escape its nature, which, in addition to being that of a legislative body, is peculiarly an American legislative body. That is to say, it bears not only the stamp of all legislatures, for good and ill, for both good and ill, but the unique markings imposed by the American Constitution. That is at once its special grace and its special problem. Listen carefully here. The grace consists in the fact that ours is not a simple minded democracy in which temporary majority opinion is allowed to prevail. Thank God. Geographical districting in the House, 1. State equality in the Senate, 2. Bicameralism, 3. Staggered elections, 4. And in and of themselves assure that only certain kinds of majorities can emerge victorious. This complex majoritarian formula is in every respect compounded by the separation of powers, 5. There's 5 things mentioned there. 5 checks on the legislature. And by ways in which the president and Congress are constitutionally authorized to involve themselves in one another's business, 6 checks and balances. So you have 5 things and then a 6th one that are features of our system, of the Constitution, that prevent whimsy majorities from going crazy. It could be worse if we didn't have this, is what he's saying, and he's correct. It could be worse. Congress, both alone and its interaction with the executive, was designed to reflect the full diversity of popular opinion. It was designed to create what Jefferson called reasonable majorities, in contrast to those that were merely factious, fractious, or fictitious. Hard to believe, but it could be worse. Don't forget it. The special problems to which this complicated process of majority formulation are prone have been well known and long remarked. If at its best Congress truly represents the splendid diversity of the nation, at its worst it reflects, while being on its own unable to remedy, the disarray of the same large and unwieldy nation. If, on occasion, Congress succeeds heroically in transcending the centrifugal impulse of its nature, more often than not, and even despite its best efforts, it resembles now more than ever that scuffle of local interests. Just realized. That scuffle of local interests, spoken of nearly a century ago. Whether the diversity represented by Congress can yield national unity and coherence of policy has, in a sense, always been the central practical question posed by the American constitutional system. The theory of representation under which Congress, especially the House, operates is essentially that of James Madison as set forth in the 10th paper of The Federalist. According to Madison, the multifarious interests emanating from an extensive commercial republic would, in effect, negate each other, preventing, on the one hand, the dominion of majority faction, while on the other, permitting relatively disinterested deliberation about the common good. This is not the place to debate the wisdom of the Madisonian vision, but suffice it to say that the system as chronicled by Fiorina seems to have yielded results not fully anticipated by Madison. What we behold with the emergence of the welfare state is less the threat of a factional majority than the petty tyranny of 1,000 minority interests, each guarded by an entrenched protectorate in the Congress and the bureaucracy. The sum of their efforts is a grotesquely bloated federal budget and chronic and progressively debilitating inflation, and a government endlessly and fecklessly preoccupied with the problem of getting and spending. If anything like deliberation of the sort that Madison thought essential to the creation of sound public policy occurs, it occurs mostly by accident. I would say it's occurring on purpose now, right now. And it's a rare moment. And I think we need to really observe this and rejoice. What then is to be done? The burden of Fiorina's argument is that Congress, left to its own devices, lacks both the institutional structure and increasingly the electoral motive to alter its profligate ways. That's true. Such hope as there is for fundamental reform will have to spring from other sources, and specifically the presidency. And it's like he is watching 2025 occur right now. It is true that every president since at least Franklin Roosevelt has bemoaned his inability to control the executive branch. It is also true that while the president sits atop a sizable establishment on the organization charts, his effective control over much of that establishment has been greatly diminished. See, that's what Trump is fighting right now. And God bless him for it. Good for him. The entire executive power is vested in a president. Did you guys know that? From Article 2, we're going to do a whole episode on Scalia's dissent in Morrison versus Olson, 1988. Yep, 1988. I know I sound like Rain Man right now. In 1988, kicked and pulled in 1988. No. Let's get back to Uhlmann here. I'm having a great time. I don't know about you guys. It is true that every president, okay, we already read that part. It is true. Franklin Roosevelt, greatly diminished. Even so, the president is the one official who can be held politically accountable for the collective acts of the national government. And he is therefore the only person with the requisite incentive to alter the status quo. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. This is published in 1978. It's like he's talking about February 2025. He may be hampered by the same entrenched factions which make his intervention necessary, but he's not helpless. Indeed, he has a golden opportunity at the moment thanks to this taxpayers' revolt. This is the revolt that elected Ronald Reagan in 1980. The operative principle of politics and the welfare state, as Harry Hopkins once put it, is spend, spend, tax, tax, elect, elect. But in the discontent of the taxpayer, one beholds the possibility of a different political calculus. It may well be that the voter is now prepared to see in the diminution of government an interest almost as palpable as the expectancy of a government benefit. Wow. Stick that on a coffee mug. That's July on Natural Right magazine, the centerfold. I'm going to read that again. I'm going to read that again. In the discontent of the taxpayer, one beholds the possibility of a different political calculus. It may well be that the voter is now prepared to see in the diminution of government an interest almost as palpable as the expectancy of a governmental benefit. The popularity of proposals to reduce taxes and to limit government spending is testimony to the growing discontent of the electorate. And we're trying to nurture that. We're trying to connect the dots for people. But voter sentiment on this subject, for all its potency, is still relatively inchoate and diffuse. What we need is a comprehensive articulation of what ails the system and a systematic plan to remedy its defects. And sometimes that plan means you sleep on the floor in USAD in a red, white, and blue sleeping bag, even though you're a billionaire. Only the president can provide the necessary understanding, only he can engender a constituency of such size and force as to be capable of effecting lasting results. If he does not act soon, the opportunity of a lifetime may be lost, and we may find ourselves more deeply embedded than ever in Fiorina's Washington quagmire. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. That's Michael-Uhlmann on Morris Fiorina's Congress, Keystone to the Washington Establishment. Thanks for joining me on The Republican Professor. If you want to support the podcast, please do. We need it. We definitely need it. Okay. I'm serious, guys. Send it in. Dig into your pocket and send something. It's anything. Anything it helps. Send a letter encouraging me. Write comments. But we do need the funds to keep the thing going. We're up against a bureaucracy that's tax funded, man. I'm not tax funded. Okay? I know it's hard for you to understand this, but not everybody gets government benefits. And sometimes that really hurts the whole thing. Okay? At the Republican Professor on Venmo. You know how to spell. We'll catch you next time.